Okay, let's begin. Okay, this is a presentation about the role of the United Nations in promoting and enforcing human rights, part of the HSC legal studies core topic on human rights. This belongs in the second part of the syllabus on promoting and enforcing human rights. Let's begin. Okay, so what is United Nations? You should probably know what this is based on your studies of world order. There are two aims I'm particularly interested in. First is promoting peace, promotes peaceful settlement of disputes. This is done usually through diplomatically at the General Assembly level, at the Security Council level, and judicially also through the International Court of Justice. Also, the other one is to promote and enforce global norm of human rights. And I really encourage students to be comfortable with the word global norm or norm. Okay, so this is the word norm basically means standards that everybody accepts or that most people accepts. Human rights law, as you will remember, is not usually enforceable. It's usually grows and becomes stronger through persuasion. So the more nations that comply and abide by human rights law, the stronger the norm would be. Okay, so what are some of the bodies that you need to be familiar with? I'm just going to run through them quickly. You should know about the General Assembly. You should know about Security Council. You should know about the International Court of Justice, although I'm not going to talk about ICJ today in the presentation. I'm leaving that to the courts and tribunals. You may not know about ECOSOC, the Economic and Social Council, but you might know of some of the bodies that comes under ECOSOC, such as World Health Organization or the United Nations Environment Programme or the International Labour Organization. But the ones I'm really concerned about today would be the Human Rights Council and also the Human Rights Committee. Okay, and also there is a High Commissioner of Refugees, but I'm not going to really talk about that today. And finally, there's the UN Secretariat, which is an office run directly under Ban Ki-moon, by the Secretary General, who's currently Ban Ki-moon, a former South Korean diplomat who has now been elected to be the Secretary General of the United Nations. You may not know that much about the office, but you do know what department that runs under the UN Secretariat, and that's the UN Department for Peacekeeping Operations. So, although it is the United Nations Security Council that authorizes peacekeeping operations, it is the Secretariat that actually runs it directly. Okay, so what are some of my overall view that perhaps can provide guidance for how you go about writing your human rights response? Okay, so first of all, I think the UN does actually play a very critical role in promoting human rights as a norm. But however, it has struggled to enforce human rights. So promotion and enforcement are clearly two different things. UN's, that's a pretty good job in promoting, but not so good in enforcing human rights law. Why is that the case? Well, probably because of sovereignty. Although I try to avoid using word sovereignty as a catch-all explanation for everything. Basically, some countries in the UN typically would manipulate the United Nations institution to their own selfish political ends. So you're going to see several examples of that today. All right. There are 190 UN General Assembly. You know about this body. 190. It has representation of every nations in the body, including, by the way, the Vatican. I don't need to go through all the details. I think the most important thing you need to know is that there's a lot of diplomacy that happens in the General Assembly level, and there's a lot of negotiation, and a lot of treaties actually do come about. Multilateral treaties come about through the General Assembly. All right, some of the treaties or conventions that you should know about. You know the UDHR, I'm sure. You should know the ICCPR. You should know the ICSCR. These three, of course, known as the International Bill of Rights. You probably have heard of Geneva Convention. Right now, currently, is called the Fifth Geneva Convention because they have to update Geneva Convention, due to the changes in, rules of armed conflict. And of course, you should know about the Convention on the Rights of the Child, or CROC. Right. Treaties and promotion. Treaties is not an organizational part of human rights, but treaties is actually what underline a lot of the human rights law. So treaties are very important, therefore, because treaties indicates that nations are willing to comply with the terms of the treaties, and through which then they would then go home and then ratify those treaties into domestic legislations. Enforcement in human rights law, by and large, happens through domestic realm after ratification. One of the few exceptions for that, by the way, would be the European Union. But even then, that only came up because nation states in the member states of the EU ratified domestic treaties and other relevant EU treaties, thereby making EU law binding on them. Okay, treaties often come about through, diplomatic negotiations, and also through lobbying from NGOs, which we'll talk about when we get to NGOs. How do human rights treaties usually enforce? Well, it does get enforced through UN committees, but mostly through ratification of domestic laws, as you know about. It does get enforced sorta through adjudication by international courts. Okay, you know about ICJ, but we will learn about the Human Rights Committee later on. It also gets enforced through the UN Security Council resolution, but as you know, UN Security Council resolution does not always enforce every single decision that comes through from the international courts, and often the enforcement comes about as a reflection of the political interests of the member states of the United Nations Security Council. Okay. Some treaties that you should know. Well, I'm just going to click through these and hopefully that you really know what they are. I'm sure you know this one already. You should know the CEDAW, and that it was ratified into the Sex Discrimination Act in Australia. You should know, of course, the ICCPR, and of course you would know that there are many rights that are identified and described in the ICCPR. Regards to abolition of slavery, this in Australia is actually ratified through the Criminal Code Act 1995, and one example of that would be the R against Ray 10 case, 2008, which I don't think I need to talk about, but you're welcome to go on Google and look up that case. There should be some very brief description about it online. Okay, Security Council. It's very important that you use the term enforcement arm or enforcement mechanism of the United Nations. Okay, this is where enforcement can happen. It can enforce, is resolution enforceable? So whereas General Assembly, their resolutions are through persuasions, UN Security Council can force nation states to act. It can actually turn UN Security General Assembly resolution into enforceable resolution. It can turn the rulings of ICJ into enforceable resolutions. It can turn the decision of ICC or the request of ICC into enforceable resolutions. You get the idea. All right. Now, the enforcement usually can come through as sanctions. It can also come through as intervention into sovereignty. Okay, so what sort of intervention sovereignty we talk about? First of all, there's peacekeeping operation that usually authorized under Chapter 6 of the United Nations Charter. We'll talk about peacekeeping a little bit later. Or UN can actually authorize actual military interventions. And a good example of that would be the Libya intervention during the Libyan civil war, which was authorized under and the UN intervention into that war came under the UN Security Council Resolution 1973. Okay, you know about this membership business, and you should be familiar with the whole veto issue. More importantly, you really need to be comfortable in talking about why veto may or may not be a problem in relations to enforcement of human rights. I suggest that if you do go about that, we might want to talk about the Syrian civil war and how the United Nations Security Council was inactive in that in that situation. All right, peacekeeping. You should know about what peacekeeping is. I've identified over here already what are some of the roles of peacekeepings. It is actually really important. Peacekeeping is actually quite important because a lot of conflict situation invariably have a human rights dimension or human rights violation dimension, I should say. The royal peacekeepers are quite important in terms of coordinating NGO and providing peace and security for civilians in conflict zones and monitoring human rights abuses on the ground. But do they work? Well, it's been a fairly mixed records. You know about some success. I'm sure you know about Interfetch. And yes, there are actually some other examples of successful peacekeeping operations as well. However, have been also some very dramatic failures. So I guess like a student, or I don't know, like anyone, I guess, sometimes if you've got massive screw-ups, you get tagged by that massive screw-up. So what's been some of the massive screw-ups of peacekeeping operations? Well, UNAMIR in Rwanda certainly was one of them. This is where the UN peacekeepers failed to protect civilians the Tutsis, who were targets of a genocidal attack by the Hutu militias. And for that matter, the UN mission in Bosnia also failed, particularly in a town called Srebrenica, that you should know about. Okay, why did they fail? Well, the first reason was ROE, or rules of engagement, were not suitable. A Chapter 6 mission was ill-suited to a conflict situation. It's more suited generally to when there's a fairly stable ceasefire. They were basically there to monitor and supervise the ceasefire. In a modern warfare or in modern conflicts where the division between ceasefire and actual conflict is often blurred, peacekeeping operation has been, the Chapter 6 peacekeeping operation has been quite ill-suited for that kind of conflict. In some peacekeeping operation, there has been lack of troops and equipment, certainly more so in the case of Rwanda, and also in the case of Rwanda, there have been a lack of political will to support these peacekeeping operations. Okay, so what has come about as a result of these failures? Well, the major attempt to reform peacekeeping was the Brahimi Report 2000, and this is a UN Secretariat Commission report, basically looking into how they could prevent another Rwanda or Srebrenica. So they came up with several proposals to reform peacekeeping. Some of them involve a proposal to create a UN's ready armed forces. Some of them involve improving training of UN peacekeepers and also improving intelligence gathering for intelligence operation for UN peacekeepings. In the case of training, one would argue that has not yet been all that well implemented. And one example that would definitely be in an article that is actually uploaded on the learning portal. This is the UN article on France 24 or France 24 in French. This article talks about basically how more than 100 peacekeepers, some of them were French, were accused of sexual abuse of minors in Central African Republic. Okay, so the article about what the Syrian dictator. Anyway, never mind. Okay, so now, perhaps one good side to that story, the tragic story, is that these peacekeepers will actually try for the alleged crimes of sexual abuse of minors. There have been examples in the past where, in fact, peacekeepers were accused of similar crimes and nothing happened to them. So at least in these regards, these peacekeepers were definitely have been held accountable for the crimes. But it does really highlight the point that a lot of peacekeepers are not really well trained for the operation, for the immensely important operation, mission that they have been tasked with. I really think that you should get to know about the Human Rights Committee, often get confused with the Human Rights Council. It's been called a quasi-judicial body. What does that mean? It basically means it's not a court, but however, it passes rulings on disputes that comes before them. And also the people who staff the UN Human Rights Committee, they're not judges. They are human rights experts, however, appointed by UN to basically monitor compliance with the ICCPR. So UN Rights Committee should also be referred to as a treaty-based committee. So it only focuses on violations of ICC, or allegations of violations of ICCPR. It can pass rulings, but these rulings are not binding on nation states, so nations can choose to ignore those rulings if they so choose to, at which point you probably go, yes, what's the point? But nation states in the past have quite often chosen to comply with these rulings. So maybe not so much about enforceability in a strict sense, but certainly they are powerfully persuasive. One excellent example of that would be the case Tunin and Australia in 1994. You should be familiar with that case. This is the one where a Tasmanian gay man by the name of Tunin, he took the state government of Tasmania to court, challenged their the laws which in 1990s criminalized male homosexuality. However, that challenge fell at a local level, so he took the Australian government in this case to the United Nations Human Rights Committee on the basis that one of the state governments that violated the ICCPR. The Human Rights Committee ruled in favor of Ms. Tunin. Now, the interesting thing is that the Australian federal government then chose to comply with the ruling and activated the Section 51 of the Australian Constitution, which authorizes the federal government to comply with international agreements that they have signed. And because of that, they were able to overrule the Tasmanian Criminal Code with regards to homosexuality. So Human Rights Committee, their rulings are not binding, but they can work. Okay. Human Rights Council, well, this is the one that I would like that you should get very cynical about in an SA situation. Because it's a more political body. It represents the nations. It has 47 member states. So in many ways, it represents the political interests of 47 member states that are on the Human Rights Committee. Some of the members of the Human Rights Committee have really bad, really atrocious human rights records. And certainly that creates a credibility gaps for the Human Rights Council as a result. And these nation states that are on that council, they in theory try to undermine the actual working of the Human Rights Council, and so that basically Human Rights Council would be powerless or ineffective when it comes to monitoring their very own violations of human rights. Okay, so the word credibility cap, coined by Ban Ki-moon. Now, there is one nation that actually gets criticized by UN Council a lot, and that's the state of Israel. And while one may not say that Israel has a perfect human rights record, it does beg us the imagination that Israel seems to be the main focus of Human Rights Council, and not say the human rights violation of someone's of a country, say Saudi Arabia or China or so on. In fact, Saudi Arabia is currently the president of the UN Human Rights Council, which really compound the credibility gap in regards to Human Rights Council. There are some media articles I really suggest you have a look at and use that and refer to some part of it in your 7-mark response. One is here, article in Reuters. Okay, the other is an article in Washington Post. This is regards to Saudi Arabia's being the president of the UN Human Rights Council. All right, let's get to the last point, which is about what you should put in or not put in the 7-marker. Okay, now there are two parts here. One's the blue bit, one's the black bit. Blue bits are the parts that I think you really have to put in. You really should put in. Black bits are the bits that I think you could choose. You can pick and choose basically. All right. My main okay. First of all, the main point. You should start with the main thesis, even if it's a 7 marker. Never mind a 7 marker or 15 mark crime essay response or a 25 mark optional essay response. Should always start with some brief idea that addresses the question somewhat, even if it's a brief statement. Yeah, you might write about that, but you might include it in your main thesis or your first paragraph, however you want to do it. I think you should go into treaties because treaties are what promotes the global norms of human rights, and some of the treaties are fairly important, like the International Bill of Rights, for instance. And you should certainly talk about the importance of ratification, because ratification is, in fact, how human rights are enforced in international law. Okay, UNGA, yeah, maybe. But then you might have mentioned already UNGA in the context of talking about treaties, so maybe not so important. Human Rights Committee, however, is very important, and I think you should talk about what it is. Please go back and look at your previous slides to see what it is. And you should also talk about Tuning Australia case as well. All right, Security Council, yeah, I think that's important because that's the enforcement mechanism of the United Nations. And you should definitely talk about how problematic it is in terms of the enforcement of human rights related laws or rulings. Peacekeeping is actually good to talk about, but it depends on how much space you've got. Keeping in mind that you do want to talk about the Human Rights Council, so yeah, it's a bit of a pick and choose on this one whether you want to talk about peacekeeping or not. And of course, Human Rights Council, and it's important to have Human Rights Council in there because this is a chance where you get to be really, really critical. Okay, all right, and definitely refer to the media articles. Okay, so I guess I'll see you next time. I'll hope to come up with more presentations that would help you in your revisions and so on. Okay, all right, talk to you later. Bye.